Welcome to my presentation about nanoscale heterogeneity in materials that we achieve by small-scale chemical gradients. And we realize such chemical gradients by segregation engineering, specifically at lattice defects. So I have done this with a couple of very fine colleagues in my institute, as highlighted here, and I will emphasize their contributions as we go along. First of all, the question, why is that topic at all of any interest? We know that the properties of materials are of course relevant at the macroscopic scale. On the other hand, the defects that create certain properties live at the atomic scale. And we have spent decades in investigating their structural features, and nowadays we are capable of studying both their structure and chemistry features at the same time. And hence we want to understand how we can modify macroscopic properties by better modifying and of course understanding the interplay of structure and chemistry at individual lattice defects. Let me explain this with a couple of simple examples. We all know such a picture of a simple edge dislocation and assume that edge dislocation is now decorated by solutes. And that can be by solid decoration, that can be by a particle formation, or can be by some order structured locally. Whatever it exactly is, it is a local structural chemical state. And if you generalize it a little bit, then we all know from textbook certain statistical descriptions of such interplays, such as, for instance, the Cottrell cloud at dislocation cores. The same applies for stacking faults, where we know this local decoration of the stacking fault in terms of the Suzuki effect. And of course in terms of the famous Gibbs adsorption isotherm when it comes to the decoration of grain boundaries. But the point we want to make here is that all of these features can not only appear in a statistical sense, as we know it from textbooks, but also in maybe much more highly regular and thermodynamic and ordered ways. And this is what we want to discuss here in the presentation. Let me give you a very practical example. We all know such movies. This is a Rolls-Royce turbine taken from the internet. And in the combustion chamber, as we all know, you have the highest temperature in this material, and we have to use nickel-based superalloys in a single crystalline state to withstand these temperatures. Now we take a little fly-through, here taken from a collaboration with the universities of Bochum and Erlangen in terms of a DFG-funded special research center. Now when you fly through, you can realize when you come closer that the nickel-based superalloys consist of a microstructure of very finely arranged cubic precipitates of gamma prime structure, which is basically an L12 crystal structure. And when you take one of these particles out and look at the stacking force in such an order structure as you see here, and when you take an atom probe across such a stacking fault like is highlighted here, and you investigate it first by high-resolution electron microscopy, you see already here the contrast change across this picture where the stacking fault had been placed. And you even conduct atomic scale resolution, then you can already see in terms of the segregation signal, in terms of the chemical signal here, that there's a change in chemistry at this stacking fault in the L12 structure. Now when you then take exactly the same portion of material and it evaporated in an atom probe tomography experiment, you can see, and we show that later in much more detail, a very complex chemical partitioning between the gamma prime, the leading dislocation, and the stacking fault in terms of the aluminum and of the chromium and of the other elements too. This is just a simple example to show you the complex interplay of structure and chemistry at lattice defects. This is a second example taken from the world of steels. This is iron-carbon martensite. You see here the reconstruction of the original austenitic grain from an EBSD measurement. Now, with a couple of crystallographic rules, you can decompose it into the individual packets, as you see here, and deeper into the lath substructure. Now, when you switch from the EBSD to the electron channeling contrast imaging, you can see a distribution of very fine and coarse laths. And with serial sectioning, for instance in a FIP or in a robot, you can even do that in 3 dimensions. The main point, however, for this specific lecture is shown here. When you take a TEM micrograph of these lath, very fine lath microstructure edge-on, and conduct exactly in the same portion of material an atom probe experiment again, then you can see the decoration of the lath interfaces by carbon. That means even in martensite, where the carbon is meant to be frozen in, you have a very strong decoration of the interfaces by carbon, because during the quenching process the carbon has definitely enough time to decorate them. Now let me render this a little bit more technical. The question is, how exactly do we do such measurements of chemistry changes at lattice defects? We have different means of doing that nowadays. One is atom probe tomography, as I've already shown, and we can do that together with what we call atom probe crystallography, which means that you sometimes in an atom probe experiment you can reveal certain crystallographic features and use them to interpret certain crystallographic features of the portion of material that you are probing. Another technique is the combination of field ion microscopy and atom probe tomography. And you see here a little movie from the field ion microscope where, with the help of an image gas, the position of the individual surface atoms is shown, and by sequential evaporation of these atoms you can track their individual atomic positions and reconstruct solids in full 3D. Another technique that we often take as a gold standard, and already showed you 2 examples of it, is that we try to conduct both atom probe tomography and electron microscopy exactly on the same portion of material. We do that through specific sample holders, where you first subject an atom probe needle to a TEM or STEM experiment with all the techniques that you have there, up to high resolution even, and then you evaporate the very same sample in the atom probe and bring these 2 data sets together, such as shown here. So this is a certain gold standard where you have the highest resolution in structure from the electron microscope and the highest resolution in chemistry from the atom probe tomography. And a currently emerging field is, of course, the machine learning and simulation enhanced analysis both of STEM, of atom probe, and of field ion microscopy images. So let me show you a bit more detail about the low-dimensional thermodynamics at such lattice defects. Here is an example from a binary system, just iron and 9% manganese, which is also the basis of many currently studied so-called medium manganese steels. But here we studied just the binary system. You can see again a dual experiment, or correlative experiments as we call it, where the needle was first investigated in the electron microscope, for instance to characterize all the defects such as the dislocations and the interfaces. And then the sample was transported to the atom probe in order to get the exact chemical distribution. And when you now extract individual defects, such as shown here in terms of a single dislocation, you can see a very strong decoration of that dislocation. And you follow these arrows, such as shown here, arrow number 1, arrow number 2, and plot the concentration across those dislocations, then you can see an enormous enrichment at these dislocations above 20 or 23%. Here, different positions, here you even reach a manganese concentration in this binary alloy above 25% in the core of the dislocation. So that is much, much higher than what you would assume from a statistical classical Cottrell cloud picture. And from the chemical analysis, this partitioning ratio that we find here even points at the local manganese enrichment at an austenite when it is adjacent to the ferrite. So we had the suspicion that there might be a local transformation inside of the dislocation core, which my colleague Rita Kuzmina and Steffi Sandlöbes could then indeed reveal by electron microscopy measurements, where you show local transformations in these dislocation cores. That means we have a phase transformation only at the decorated portions of certain dislocations. What was also very interesting to find is when you follow the dislocations along their line vectors, here now shown by vector 1 and vector number 2, following the line direction of the respective dislocations and plotting this here in terms of a manganese segregation profile along those line vectors, then you interestingly see huge variations in composition when following this dislocation line. And we interpreted this in terms of a dislocation spinodal, so a low-dimensional spinodal effect. And when you translate your thermodynamics to these segregation points that we had, like 15% roughly, then you can show by classical thermodynamic calculations that indeed such a composition would be prone to decompose into different adjacent compositions in a spinodal form. So let me show you this in terms of a simple schematical sketch. Here we have a simple dislocation structure, such as shown in the beginning, and some solute atoms. Now you allow for diffusion, and these solute atoms start decorating the dislocation core. That brings your local concentration profile out as shown here and as we have measured, as shown before. But the chemical potential is constant, so it's an equilibrium segregation. And we all know in global thermodynamics, such a dislocation as a defect would not exist. But if it does exist, if it's so to say thermodynamically frozen in, then you have an equilibrium segregation that gives you a new concentration working point, which is now here and not here where you expect it for the global equilibrium. And if you translate that now into the phase diagram, and of course only here into a bulk phase diagram, then you had your original point for the bulk system here in the solid solution state where no decoration takes place. And you have your new chemical working point at the core of the dislocation, such as shown here, which can now end up somewhere totally different in the phase diagram, for instance also in a spinodal. This is of course a hand-waving argumentation because we all know the bulk phase diagram does not automatically apply for the defect region, but it shows us that when you have a different coordination and a different distortion field and so on, you can indeed encounter profoundly different thermodynamic states. And that can then lead to a one-dimensional or low-dimensional spinodal decomposition, such as schematically shown here, and that indeed corresponds to the experimental results that we have shown before. This applies also to the grain boundaries. So I stay for a moment still in the same alloy system, binary system iron with 9% manganese. And now we take a look at this manganese decorated grain boundary, which you see highlighted here. Now let me magnify that, and now we look into the grain boundary plane. And inside of the grain boundary plane you have a similar situation. You see now enormous variations in the concentration, reaching from something like 5 or 6 or 7% in the minima up to 25% and higher in the maxima. So that is really a huge variation in the manganese content inside of the same grain boundary. And when you cut with an arrow through such an experiment, you get again similar variations as we have seen before on single dislocations. And we have cast this into a phase field calculation, which shows with the corresponding boundary conditions applying to the grain boundary region, you see indeed that you get such decompositions also predicted from the phase field simulation. Now when you wait but a little bit longer or choose a slightly different system or go to a different heat treatment, then such highly decorated regions, such as shown here in a nanoscaled Maraging type of steel, can lead to local decoration plus phase transformation. So you see here from a formerly manganese decorated grain boundaries that when you wait long enough, this starts to transform back into nanolayers of austenite, which are adjacent to the ferrite that is surrounding them. And indeed, when you conduct corresponding diffraction experiments, you can see such nanolayers at formerly decorated grain boundaries which have transformed into austenite. So we have a phase formation in cubic ferritic phases back into austenite after chemical decoration. Now you can systematically apply that and use that. Here you have, for instance, such a cubic martensite because it's practically carbon-free, so it maintains a cubic crystallographic structure in the as-quenched state. So you see only BCC iron and a relatively coarse, blocky martensitic structure. Now you subject that to a heat treatment, such as shown here, and then you get this decoration of the lath interfaces and a gradual reversion from alpha back to gamma. This is indicated here by the little red lines, and you get also some epsilon indicated by these blue regions. When you magnify that a little bit, you can nicely see the details, and here you see you practically create something like a self-driven formation of a Damascene type of nanolaminate. So with multiple gradients in the microstructure, just by the segregation and locally confined transformation of the lattice defects, here namely of the lath interfaces. That was by my colleague Motomichi Koyama in a very nice study used for a fatigue experiment. And you can indeed see, like shown here, when a crack comes through, as you see here, and here's a corresponding EBSD map of such a crack that goes under fatigue loading conditions through the material, that all the areas where the crack passed through were locally transformed back from the metastable austenite back to the ferrite, creating closure stresses that change the expansion rate of this crack. And indeed, this material, when subjected to cyclic loading, performed much better than the steel in a non-reverse state, or compared to other reference alloys too. So you can use such local gradients and such local decoration and local nanolayered phase transformation structures for designing new materials with higher fatigue resistance or also toughness. This is totally switching gears now, showing you just that you can unleash the same type of local thermodynamics for a totally different macroscopic property. This is not a steel, but this is a thermoelectric material based on the silver antimonium tellurium system. And the assignment, as you know, in thermoelectric materials is to enhance the phonon scattering. And the idea here is that we pursued to decorate the dislocations and grain boundaries in these materials in such a way that this decoration leads to chemical effects that enhance the phonon scattering at them, and by that improving the figure of merit. And you see here in terms of this magnification, for instance, indeed that this decoration works in these materials, particularly when adding silver. Here's yet another example that is just a paper which is now in press in Science Advances by Red Zhou. He is a Humboldt fellow in our group and did together with Jabamir and Rudy a wonderful set of experiments, together with Greg Thompson also from Alabama, where they synthesize a set of alloys in the platinum-gold system. This is shown here in terms of the phase diagram. What makes this alloy, however, very special is that this, indicated by this little red star, is the nominal composition of the bulk material. So it's in the solid solution regime at this heat treatment point and this concentration. However, at the individual types of lattice defects, dislocations specifically here, you get different decoration states depending on the type of dislocation. And for the different types of dislocation with their individual distortion fields, shown here in terms of low angle grain boundaries with a only short range distortion field, freestanding or glissile dislocations with a higher, less compensated stress field, and stacking foil tetraeder with a yet higher distortion field, and even Frank loops, which have very high distortions in them. You find for all of these structures an individual state of chemical decoration, which the authors were also capable to reveal by theory. That means the chemical decoration of the dislocations is not only a specific feature of one dislocation as such, but of the exact array in which you place it, of the exact distortion field and nanostructure that surrounds it. So it's a very, very complex interplay between the type of defect, the arrangement of the defects, and the chemical decoration state. And with that, I kind of come to the graphical conclusion and show here a picture that has been devised by the group of Sandra Korte-Kerzel, professor at RWTH Aachen, under the umbrella of a new collaborative research center that I've listed here. And that kind of pursues this idea of bringing these microstructure defect cosmos that we all know and work with on a daily basis, together with the thermodynamics, with the phase diagrams, but in the form that you have phase diagrams behind each and every defect. So the question is how to develop defect phase diagrams that really explain you on solid thermodynamic grounds how the chemical state of a defect can be understood, described, and of course be manipulated. So with that, I come to a couple of conclusions. I hope I could show you that we have very strong segregation effects to defects, but that these segregation effects are often not of a statistical nature alone, but that very strong atomic interactions apply once the atoms have segregated. In classical isotherm descriptions, this amounts to saying that we follow more a Fowler-Guggenheim or Hart or Guttmann type of isotherm rather than the Gibbs isotherm description, which is free of atomic interactions. And that can lead to very complex local thermodynamic states, such as, for instance, spinodal effects, and that would, of course, also change our picture of heterogeneous nucleation, which does not only have then anymore the advantage of the available interface, but also precursor transient states that can, for instance, come from locally confined spinodal decomposition features. And this is, for instance, happening at several dislocations, that is happening at grain boundaries, and depends on what kind of underlying phase diagram you have. And the take-home message from all of these results achieved by theory and achieved by correlative atom probe tomography and electron microscopy means that we most likely have a specific type of phase diagram behind each and every defect. And that is, I think, a very interesting research topic for the future. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.